The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Thomas Williams adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 1,000th time. At 28 years old, he had been serving as one of the Queen's guards for nearly 6 years, and the weight of tradition pressed down on him like the heavy bearskin hat that crowned his head. Thomas had always dreamed of this moment as a young boy growing up in Manchester. His grandfather had served in the Coldstream Guards during World War II, filling Thomas's childhood with stories of honor, duty, and unwavering dedication to the crown. Now, standing at attention outside the palace gates, Thomas embodied everything. His grandfather had taught him about service and sacrifice. The rules were simple, but absolute. Never move, never speak, never break character no matter what happened around him. Tourists could shout, cameras could flash, and people could try every trick in the book to make him flinch, but a Queen's Guard remained as motionless as a statue. This wasn't just a job, it was a sacred duty that connected him to centuries of British military tradition. On this particular Tuesday morning in September, London was buzzing with its usual energy. Tour buses filled with excited visitors lined the street, and the familiar crowd of tourists gathered behind the Black Iron. Railings, cameras ready to capture the famous guards in their iconic uniforms. Children pressed their faces against the bars, hoping to catch a glimpse of the soldiers who seemed more like living monuments than real people. Thomas had witnessed it all during his years of service. Marriage proposals happening right in front of him. Arguments between couples, lost children crying for their parents, and countless attempts by tourists to make him smile or move. He had learned to focus his mind elsewhere, thinking about his training, his family, or simply counting the minutes until his shift ended. But today felt different somehow. As Thomas took his position, he noticed a small family approaching the gates. A man in his 30s walked slowly, supporting a woman who moved with obvious difficulty. Between them walked a little girl, perhaps 7 years old, wearing a bright yellow dress that seemed to capture every ray of sunlight that filtered through the London clouds. The family moved differently from the typical tourists. There was no rushing, no excited chatter, no frantic picture-taking. Instead, they approached with a quiet reverence that caught Thomas's attention, even as he maintained his rigid stance. The little girl's eyes were wide with wonder as she stared up at him, but there was something else in her gaze that he couldn't quite identify. As they drew closer, Thomas could see the mother more clearly. She was pale and thin, wearing a colorful headscarf that couldn't quite hide the fact that she had no hair underneath. The father's eyes were red-rimmed, and his hand never left his wife's arm, as if he were afraid she might collapse at any moment. But it was the little girl who held Thomas's attention. Despite whatever hardship her family was facing, her face radiated pure joy and excitement at being so close to the palace. The family stopped directly in front of Thomas's post. The little girl tugged on her father's sleeve and whispered something that Thomas couldn't hear. The father knelt down to her level, and Thomas could see him explaining something gently to his daughter. The mother sat down on a nearby bench, clearly exhausted from the short walk. Through his peripheral vision, Thomas watched as the family interacted. The little girl kept pointing at him with excitement, her small hands gesturing animatedly as she spoke to her parents. Her mother smiled weakly but genuinely, nodding at whatever her daughter was saying. The father seemed to be struggling to maintain his composure, his jaw tight with emotion. Other tourists began to gather around the family, some pointing cameras in their direction, others whispering among themselves. Thomas felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a protective instinct that he had never experienced during his years of duty. This family wasn't here for the typical tourist experience. There was something deeper, something more meaningful about their presence. The little girl approached the rope barrier that separated the public from the guards area. She stood there for several minutes, simply looking up at Thomas with those bright, curious eyes. He could see her lips moving slightly, as if she were having a conversation with him, even though he couldn't respond. Her innocence and wonder reminded him of why he had wanted to become a guard in the first place, to be part of something larger than himself, to represent the best of British tradition and honor. As the morning progressed, the family remained near Thomas's post. The mother rested on the bench while the father and daughter continued to watch the guards. Thomas began to piece together fragments of their story from the conversations he could overhear. Words like hospital, treatment, and special trip drifted to his ears, painting a picture that made his heart heavy. The little girl had clearly studied everything about the Queen's Guards before her visit. Thomas could hear her explaining to other children about the different regiments, the history of the uniforms, and the importance of the Guards' role in protecting the royal family. Her knowledge was impressive, and her enthusiasm was infectious, drawing smiles from everyone around her. But as Thomas stood there, maintaining his stoic exterior while his heart grew heavier with understanding, he realized that this family's visit to see him and his fellow guards might be one of the most important moments in that little girl's life. And for the first time in his 6 years of service, Thomas Williams began to question whether the rules that governed his duty were more important than the human connection that was calling out to him from just a few feet away. By midday, the London sun had grown warmer, and Thomas could feel sweat beginning to form beneath his heavy uniform. His feet ached in his polished boots, and the familiar strain of maintaining perfect posture for hours was settling into his muscles. But his physical discomfort paled in comparison to the emotional weight that had been building in his chest since the morning. The family with the little girl in the yellow dress had never left their spot near his post. Other tourists had come and gone, taking their pictures and moving on to the next attraction, but this family remained. The mother had been resting on the bench for most of the morning, occasionally walking slowly to stand beside her daughter, who seemed completely captivated by the guards. Thomas had overheard more of their conversations throughout the morning, and the picture that emerged broke his heart. The little girl, whose name he had learned was Emma, had been battling leukemia for over 2 years. This trip to London to see the Queen's Guards had been her one special request after completing her latest round of chemotherapy. Her parents, Sarah and Michael, had saved every penny they could to make this dream come true for their daughter. Emma's fascination with the Royal Guards had begun during her long hospital stays. She had watched documentaries, read every book she could find, and had plastered her hospital room walls with pictures of the guards in their magnificent uniforms. The pageantry, the tradition, and the unwavering dedication of the guards had captured her imagination and given her something to focus on during the darkest moments of her treatment. Now, standing just feet away from one of her heroes, Emma was experiencing pure joy. Thomas could see it in the way she stood straighter when she looked at him, in the careful way she had positioned herself to get the perfect view, and in the excited whispers she shared with her parents. For this little girl, he wasn't just a tourist attraction. He was a living symbol of everything she admired about courage, duty, and strength. As the afternoon crowd began to thin, Thomas noticed that Emma's energy was starting to flag. She had been standing and walking for hours, and her small frame was clearly exhausted. But every time her parents suggested they take a break or move to a different location, she would shake her head firmly and return her attention to Thomas and the other guards. "Please, just a little longer," Thomas heard her whisper to her father. "I want to remember everything perfectly." Those words hit Thomas like a physical blow. The way Emma said, "Remember everything perfectly," carried a weight that no 7-year-old should have to bear. It suggested that this memory needed to last her through whatever challenges lay ahead, that this moment of wonder and joy might need to sustain her through difficult times to come. Thomas thought about his own daughter, Lucy, who was about the same age as Emma. Lucy lived a life filled with ordinary childhood concerns: which cartoon to watch, what game to play, whether she could have ice cream after dinner. She had never had to be brave in the face of something as terrifying as a serious illness. She had never had to find strength and inspiration in the midst of fear and uncertainty. The contrast between his daughter's carefree existence and Emma's courageous battle made Thomas's throat tight with emotion. Here was a little girl who had endured treatments that would challenge the strongest adults, who had faced her fears with remarkable grace, and who had found solace and inspiration in the tradition that Thomas represented. She deserved more than his silence and stillness. She deserved recognition of her incredible bravery. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas noticed that other guards had become aware of the special family as well. James, who was stationed nearby, had been glancing toward Emma and her parents more frequently. William, at the next post, seemed to be listening to their conversations just as Thomas was. The guards might be bound by rules of silence and stillness, but they weren't immune to the human drama unfolding before them. Emma's mother, Sarah, had been watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and heartbreak that Thomas recognized from his own experiences as a parent. Every parent wanted to give their child the world, to protect them from pain and difficulty, to make all their dreams come true. Sarah was doing her best to make this moment perfect for Emma, even though Thomas could see the exhaustion and worry etched in every line of her face. Michael, Emma's father, was struggling even more visibly with his emotions. Thomas watched as the man stepped away several times to compose himself, wiping his eyes quickly before returning to his family's side. The weight of watching his child battle such a serious illness was evident in his every movement. But his love for Emma shone through in the gentle way he supported both his wife and daughter throughout their long day at the palace. As the late afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the courtyard, Thomas realized that this family's visit was coming to an end. He could see Sarah checking her watch, and Michael was gently suggesting they should start thinking about heading back to their hotel. Emma's protests were becoming weaker as her energy faded, though her determination to stay near the guards remained strong. Thomas felt a growing urgency building inside him. Soon, this brave little girl would walk away, and he would have missed his chance to somehow acknowledge her courage and strength. The rules that had governed his service for 6 years suddenly seemed less important than the opportunity to give Emma a moment she would truly never forget. For the first time in his career as a Queen's Guard, Thomas Williams began to seriously consider breaking the sacred protocol that defined his duty. The weight of tradition pressed down on him, but the weight of compassion was becoming stronger. As Emma prepared to say goodbye to her heroes, Thomas prepared to make the most difficult decision of his military career. The late afternoon light was beginning to fade when Thomas saw Emma's parents, gently trying to convince her that it was time to leave. Sarah had been sitting on the bench for longer periods, clearly struggling with fatigue, and Michael kept checking his phone for the time. Emma, despite her own exhaustion, was fighting their suggestions with the determination that had probably helped her through countless medical treatments. 5 more minutes, please, Emma pleaded with her parents, her small hands pressed against the rope barrier as if she could somehow get closer to Thomas through sheer will. I just want to watch them change positions one more time. Thomas's heart ached as he watched this brave little girl trying to hold on to every precious second of her dream experience. Through his peripheral vision, he could see tears threatening to spill from Sarah's eyes as she looked at her daughter. The weight of wanting to give Emma everything while managing her own physical limitations was clearly taking its toll. "Sweetheart, we've been here for hours," Michael said gently, kneeling beside Emma. "Your mom needs to rest. And we have that. Early flight tomorrow morning." The mention of their departure hit Thomas like a punch to the stomach. Tomorrow morning, this family would return to their regular life of hospital visits, treatments, and the daily battle that Emma was fighting. This magical day in London would become just a memory, though Thomas suspected it would be one that Emma would treasure for whatever time she had left. Emma turned to look at her mother, and Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out on her young face. She wanted to stay, to absorb every detail of this moment, but she also understood that her mother was unwell and needed to rest. The maturity and selflessness that illness had forced upon this 7-year-old was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Okay, Daddy," Emma said quietly, her voice thick with disappointment. "But can I say goodbye to him first?" Michael looked uncertain. "Sweetheart, you know the guards can't talk to you. They have very important jobs to do." "I know," Emma replied. "But maybe he can hear me anyway." As Emma approached the rope barrier, one final time Thomas felt his resolve crystallizing. This little girl had shown more courage in her short life than most people would ever need to display. She had faced her fears, endured incredible challenges, and had found inspiration in the very tradition that Thomas was sworn to uphold. If anyone deserved to have their faith in that tradition rewarded, it was Emma. The rules that governed his service were important. Thomas knew that. They maintained the dignity and mystery of an institution that stretched back centuries. But sometimes, Thomas realized, the spirit of those rules was more important than their letter. The Queen's Guards represented the best of British values: honor, duty, service, and protection of those who needed it most. What could be more in keeping with those values than acknowledging the courage of a little girl who had already shown herself to be a true warrior? Emma stood directly in front of Thomas, her small face tilted up toward his. Even though he couldn't look down at her directly, he could sense her presence, could feel the intensity of her gaze and the weight of her admiration. "Thank you for being so brave and strong," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the London street. "When I'm scared at the hospital, I think about you and the other guards, and it helps me be brave too. I want to be just like you when I grow up." Those words shattered whatever remaining resistance Thomas had to breaking protocol. This child saw him as a symbol of strength and courage, and she was using that symbol to find her own bravery in the face of unimaginable challenges. How could he maintain his silence when speaking, could give her strength for the battles ahead? Thomas thought about his training, about the disciplinary action he would surely face, about the disappointment of his commanding officers. But he also thought about Emma's words, about the way she had stood vigil at his post all day, about the dreams that had sustained her through her illness. He thought about his own daughter, and what he would want someone to do for her if she were in Emma's position. The other tourists had moved away, giving the family space for their goodbye. Even the ever-present photographers had stepped back, seeming to sense that something significant was happening. It was just Emma, her parents, and Thomas in their small circle of connection that transcended the usual boundaries between guard and public. Thomas could feel his fellow guards watching from their positions. James, in particular, seemed to be paying close attention to what was unfolding. Thomas wondered if they were experiencing the same internal struggle, the same battle between duty and compassion that was raging in his own heart. Sarah and Michael stood a few feet behind their daughter, allowing her this private moment with her hero. Thomas could see them both wiping their eyes, overwhelmed by their daughter's grace and strength. They had given up so much to bring Emma to London, had sacrificed financially and emotionally to make this dream possible. They deserved to see their daughter receive the recognition she so richly deserved. As Emma began to turn away, preparing to rejoin her parents and leave the palace forever, Thomas made his decision. The tradition he served was built on centuries of men who had made sacrifices for something greater than themselves. Today, Thomas Williams would honor that tradition by making his own sacrifice, not of his life, but of his career, for someone who embodied the very courage and strength that the Queen's Guards were meant to represent. Taking a deep breath, that felt like the most significant one of his life. Thomas prepared to do something that would change everything for both himself and the brave little girl in the yellow dress. Time seemed to slow as Thomas watched Emma take her first steps away from his post. Her small shoulders were slumped with disappointment, and she kept glancing back over her shoulder, as if hoping for one last moment of connection with the guard who had inspired her for so many months. Sarah and Michael flanked their daughter, supporting her emotionally as they prepared to leave the palace grounds forever. In that suspended moment, Thomas felt the weight of 6 years of training, tradition, and unwavering discipline pressing down upon him. But stronger than all of that was the image of Emma lying in a hospital bed, looking at pictures of the Queen's guards and finding the strength to face another day of treatment. Stronger than protocol was the memory of her whispered words about wanting to be brave like him. Stronger than rules was the understanding that sometimes breaking them was the most honorable thing a person could do. "Emma," Thomas said quietly, his voice cutting through the London afternoon air like a bell. The little girl stopped mid-step, her eyes growing wide with disbelief. Sarah gasped audibly, and Michael's mouth fell open in shock. Even the few remaining tourists seemed to freeze in place, sensing that something unprecedented was happening before their eyes. Slowly, carefully, Thomas turned his head to look directly down at Emma. The movement felt monumental after hours of rigid stillness, and he could see the wonder and joy spreading across the child's face like sunrise. Her yellow dress seemed to glow even brighter as she spun around to face him fully. "You are the bravest soldier I have ever met," Thomas continued, his voice thick with emotion but clear enough for Emma and her parents to hear every word. "Your courage in fighting your illness, your strength in facing each day with a smile, your determination to find joy even in difficult times, these are the qualities of a true warrior. The Queen's guards salute you." With deliberate precision, Thomas brought his hand up in a perfect military salute, holding it steady as he looked directly into Emma's shining eyes. The gesture was crisp, formal, and filled with every ounce of respect and admiration that had been building in his heart throughout the day. Emma's response was immediate and overwhelming. Tears of pure joy streamed down her cheeks as she attempted to return the salute, her small hand trembling as she brought it to her forehead in a perfect imitation of Thomas's gesture. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the decorated Queen's Guard and the 7-year-old cancer patient held their salute, 2 soldiers acknowledging each other across the barriers of age, circumstance, and protocol. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah had her hands pressed to her mouth, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Michael stood frozen, his own eyes glistening as he witnessed his daughter receiving the recognition she had dreamed of for so long. Even the handful of tourists who remained had lowered their cameras, sensing that they were witnessing something too sacred to capture casually. But Thomas wasn't finished. Having crossed the line, he was determined to give Emma the complete experience she deserved. "Would you like to inspect the guard, soldier?" he asked, using the formal tone that Emma had probably heard in the documentaries she loved so much. Emma's nod was so enthusiastic that her parents had to steady her. "Yes, sir," she managed to say, her voice cracking with emotion and excitement. Thomas stepped forward, moving away from his post for the first time in hours. Each step felt significant, each movement a further departure from the rules that had governed his service. But as he approached the rope barrier that separated him from Emma, he felt more aligned with the true spirit of his duty than he had in years. Kneeling down to Emma's eye level, Thomas could see the full impact of what this moment meant to her. Her face was radiant with wonder and joy, but he could also see the physical toll that her illness had taken. She was thinner than a healthy child her age should be, and there was a fragility to her that spoke of the battles she had fought and was still fighting. "Emma," Thomas said gently, "would you like to touch my bearskin hat? It's made from real fur and weighs about 2 pounds. Emma's gasp of delight was audible to everyone around them. With careful reverence, she reached out her small hand and gently touched the famous tall black hat that crowned Thomas's head. Her fingers explored the texture with wonder, and Thomas could see her committing every detail to memory. "It's so soft," she whispered in amazement, "and so tall. How do you keep it from falling off?" "Years of practice," Thomas replied with a smile that felt foreign after hours of stoic expression, "and a very strong chin strap that's hidden underneath." Emma giggled, a sound so pure and joyful that it seemed to lighten the very air around them. Thomas realized that in all his years of service he had never heard a more beautiful sound than this brave little girl's laughter. "Can I ask you a question?" Emma said, suddenly becoming serious. "Of course," Thomas replied. "When I'm back in the hospital and I'm scared, is it okay if I think about this moment? Will it help me be as brave as you are?" Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. This child, who had already shown more courage than most adults would ever need to display, was asking him for permission to use their moment together as a source of strength. The responsibility of that request was both humbling and inspiring. "Emma," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him, "every time you think of this moment, every time you remember our salute, I want you to know that I will be thinking of you too. Your bravery has made me a better soldier, and I will carry your courage with me always." As Thomas knelt beside Emma, sharing this profound moment, he became aware that their interaction was creating ripples far beyond their immediate circle. Other tourists had begun to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the unprecedented sight of a Queen's Guard breaking character. But rather than the usual excited chatter and flash photography, there was a reverent quiet among the observers, as if they instinctively understood they were witnessing something sacred. James, Thomas's fellow guard stationed nearby, had also broken from his rigid position. Without hesitation, he stepped forward to join Thomas and Emma, his own eyes reflecting the same mixture of compassion and determination that had driven Thomas to act. "Soldier Emma," James said formally, addressing the little girl with the same respect he would show to any distinguished visitor. "Would you honor us with an inspection of the guard?" Emma looked between Thomas and James with wonder, hardly able to believe that both of her heroes were acknowledging her. Sarah and Michael stood behind their daughter, overcome with emotion as they watched their child receive the recognition she had dreamed of for so long. "What do I do?" Emma asked, looking to Thomas for guidance. "Stand very straight," Thomas instructed gently, "and walk slowly in front of us. A good soldier always inspects the troops to make sure they're ready for duty." Emma straightened her small shoulders and assumed the most military posture her 7-year-old frame could manage. With serious concentration, she walked slowly in front of both guards, examining their uniforms with the careful attention of someone who had studied every detail in countless photographs and documentaries. "Your buttons are very shiny," she observed, solemnly, playing her role perfectly. "Thank you, soldier," James replied with equal seriousness. "We polish them every morning before duty. And your boots are so clean I can see myself in them," Emma continued her inspection. "A Queen's Guard must always be properly turned out," Thomas added, falling naturally into the role of mentor. What happened next surprised everyone, including Thomas. William, the guard at the third post, abandoned his position and marched over to join the impromptu ceremony. Then Marcus from the fourth post followed suit. Within minutes, 4 of the Queen's Guards had formed a small honor formation around Emma, all of them having made the same choice to put compassion above protocol. "Emma," William said, his voice carrying the authority of his rank, "would you do us the honor of reviewing our formation?" Emma looked to her parents with excitement and uncertainty. Sarah, despite her exhaustion, managed to nod encouragingly while Michael wiped tears from his eyes. This was beyond anything they could have imagined when they planned this trip to fulfill their daughter's dream. The guards formed a perfect line, standing at attention as Emma, guided by Thomas, walked slowly in front of each one. She examined their uniforms with the seriousness of a commanding officer, occasionally nodding with approval or asking questions about their equipment. "Why do your swords have tassels?" she asked Marcus. "They're called sword knots," he explained, patiently. "They help us grip our swords properly, and they're also a symbol of our regiment's honor." Emma absorbed every word, her eyes bright with fascination. For this moment, she wasn't a sick little girl fighting a terrible disease. She was a soldier being inducted into the traditions she had admired for so long. The gathering crowd watched in respectful silence as the ceremony continued. Some wiped away tears of their own, moved by the obvious love and respect being shown to this brave child. Others smiled at Emma's serious concentration as she performed her duties as reviewing officer. "Soldiers," Emma announced when she had completed her inspection, trying to project her small voice with authority. "You all look very smart and ready to protect the Queen." "Thank you, soldier," the guards replied in unison, their synchronized response making Emma beam with pride. But Thomas wasn't finished. He had one more gift to give this remarkable child. "Emma," he said, reaching into his tunic pocket, "every good soldier needs proper identification." He pulled out a small metal pin, his own regimental badge that he wore on his civilian clothes. It was a simple thing, but it represented years of service, training, and dedication to the values that Emma had shown she understood so well. "This badge belongs to soldiers who have shown exceptional courage and honor," Thomas said, pinning it carefully to Emma's yellow dress. "You've earned the right to wear it." Emma looked down at the badge with reverence, her small fingers touching it gently. "Can I really keep it?" she asked in wonder. "It's yours," Thomas said firmly. "Whenever you look at it, remember that you're not alone in your fight. You have an entire regiment of soldiers who believe in your courage." Sarah finally found her voice, though it was thick with tears. "Thank you," she managed to say to the guards. "You have no idea what this means to her. To all of us." Michael stepped forward, extending his hand to Thomas. "Sir, my daughter has talked about the Queen's Guards every day for 2 years. You've made her dreams come true in ways we never thought possible." As Thomas shook Michael's hand, he realized that this moment had changed him as much as it had changed Emma. For years, he had served with distinction, following orders and maintaining traditions without question. But today, he had learned that sometimes the highest form of service required breaking the rules in service of something greater. The other guards seemed to understand this too. As they began to return to their posts, there was a new energy among them, a sense that they had participated in something that transcended their usual duties. They had remembered why they had chosen to serve in the first place, not just to follow orders, but to embody the values of courage, honor, and protection that their uniforms represented. As the impromptu ceremony drew to a close, Emma stood, surrounded by her new soldier friends, wearing her regimental badge with pride and holding memories that would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The Queen's Guards had broken their silence, but in doing so, they had found their voices in the most meaningful way possible. As the London evening began to settle over Buckingham Palace, the time had come for Emma and her family to leave. The magical afternoon that had transformed from a simple tourist visit into an unforgettable ceremony of recognition was drawing to its close. But the impact of what had transpired would extend far beyond this single day. Emma stood one final time in front of Thomas, her small hand touching the regimental badge pinned to her yellow dress. The weight of the moment seemed to have aged her beyond her 7 years, giving her a dignity and composure that spoke to the strength she had developed through her battles with illness. "Thank you for making me feel like a real soldier," she said to Thomas, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I promise I'll be brave when I go back to the hospital. I'll remember that I have friends watching over me." Thomas knelt down one last time, meeting Emma at eye level. Emma, you were already a real soldier long before you met us today. You've been fighting battles that would challenge the strongest adults, and you've done it with grace and courage that puts us all to shame. We're honored to call you our fellow soldier. The goodbye was difficult for everyone involved. Sarah, despite her exhaustion, managed to thank each guard individually, her gratitude evident in every word. Michael shook hands with Thomas and the others, his eyes conveying emotions that words couldn't capture. We'll never forget this, Michael said simply. Never. As the family walked slowly toward the palace gates, Emma turned back several times to wave at the guards. Each time they responded with small salutes, maintaining their connection until she disappeared into the London evening. The consequences of Thomas's decision came swiftly. Within an hour of the family's departure, Major Harrison arrived at the guardhouse, his face stern with disapproval. Word of the guard's breach of protocol had traveled quickly through the chain of command. Williams, Harrison said sharply, you and the others broke the most fundamental rule of guard duty. You know there will be consequences. Thomas stood at attention, prepared to accept whatever punishment awaited him. Yes, sir. I take full responsibility for my actions. And what possible justification could you have for abandoning centuries of tradition? Harrison demanded. Thomas thought carefully before responding. Sir, that little girl has shown more courage in her 7 years than most people will in their entire lives. She's been fighting a battle against cancer while finding inspiration in what we represent. I believe that acknowledging her bravery was consistent with the highest values of our service. Harrison studied Thomas for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Do you understand that your career could be over? That this could result in your dismissal from the guards? Yes, sir, Thomas replied without hesitation. I understand the consequences, and I accept them. What Thomas didn't expect was what happened next. Harrison's stern expression gradually softened, and after a moment he nodded slowly. Williams, in 30 years of service, I've seen guards maintain their composure in the face of everything imaginable, but I've never seen one make the choice to break protocol for a reason as honorable as yours. While I can't officially condone what you did, I can tell you that it took more courage to break those rules than it ever did to follow them. The formal, disciplinary hearing took place 3 days later. Thomas expected the worst: dismissal from service, loss of rank, and the end of a career he had devoted his life to building. Instead, he found himself facing a panel of senior officers who had spent considerable time reviewing not just his breach of protocol, but the context that had led to it. Colonel Matthews, the presiding officer, spoke directly to Thomas. Guardsman Williams, your actions last Tuesday were unprecedented in the modern history of the Queen's Guard. However, after reviewing the circumstances and considering testimony from witnesses, this panel has concluded that your actions, while technically in violation of standing orders, were consistent with the highest traditions of service and compassion that define the British military. Thomas could hardly believe what he was hearing. Instead of dismissal, he was receiving an official reprimand that would remain in his file, but he would retain his position and rank. The other guards who had joined him received similar treatment. Furthermore, Colonel Matthews continued, this panel believes that your actions reflect positively on the Guards as an institution. You reminded us all that rules serve people, not the other way around, and that sometimes the greatest honor lies in knowing when compassion must override protocol. But the most significant consequence of that Tuesday afternoon came in the form of a letter that arrived at the guardhouse 2 weeks later. It was written in a child's careful handwriting and addressed simply to Thomas and the brave guards at Buckingham Palace. The letter read, Dear Thomas, James, William, and Marcus, I wanted to tell you about my doctor visit yesterday. When they had to do some tests that scared me, I held your badge very tight and remembered our salute. I pretended I was a soldier like you, and it helped me be brave. The doctors said I'm doing really well, and Mummy says it's because I have guardian angels watching over me. I told all my friends at the hospital about meeting you. Now they want to be brave soldiers too. I showed them pictures Daddy took, and they think you're all heroes. Tommy, who's 8 and has the same sickness as me, asked if he could meet you someday. I told him that real soldiers always help other soldiers. I wear your badge every day. When people ask about it, I tell them it's my courage badge from the bravest soldiers in the world. I'm getting stronger every day, and the doctors are very happy. Mummy and Daddy say we might be able to visit London again next year if I keep getting better. Thank you for teaching me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing what you need to do even when you are scared. That's what you do every day, and that's what I'm learning to do too. Your fellow soldier, Emma P.S. I'm learning to march properly in my bedroom. Daddy says I'm getting very good at it. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his eyes growing misty with each reading. When he shared it with the other guards, they were equally moved. Emma's words had transformed their understanding of what had happened that day. They hadn't just broken protocol for one little girl. They had provided strength and inspiration for an entire community of children fighting their own battles. The story of Emma and the guards began to spread, first through the hospital where Emma received treatment, then through social media as her parents shared their experience. The response was overwhelming. Letters began arriving from children around the world, many facing their own health challenges, all inspired by the story of the guards who had chosen compassion over rules. The palace, initially concerned about the breach of protocol, soon recognized the positive impact the story was having. Rather than punishing the guards further, they quietly established a program allowing seriously ill children to have special interactions with the guards, turning Thomas's moment of rebellion into an official policy of compassion. Months later, Thomas received news that would stay with him forever. Emma's treatment had been successful. She was in remission, growing stronger every day, and had never stopped wearing his regimental badge. But more than that, her story had inspired the creation of a charity fund that helped other families afford trips to see their children's heroes during difficult times. On the first anniversary of their meeting, Emma returned to Buckingham Palace. This time, she wasn't a frail little girl in a yellow dress. She was a healthy, vibrant 8-year-old whose hair had grown back in beautiful curls. She wore the same regimental badge, now polished bright from constant touching, and she brought with her a dozen other children from her hospital. Thomas was waiting for her, standing at the same post where they had first met. When Emma saw him, she broke into a run, her parents laughing as they tried to keep up. She stopped just short of the rope barrier and executed a perfect military salute. "Reporting for duty, sir," she said with a grin that could have powered all of London. Thomas returned the salute with tears in his eyes, knowing that he had learned as much about courage from this remarkable child as he had ever taught her. In breaking the rules that day, he had discovered that sometimes the most important part of serving something greater than yourself is knowing when to put humanity above protocol. Emma's story became a legend among the Queen's guards, passed down to new recruits as an example of what it truly means to serve with honor. And every day, as Thomas stood at his post, he carried with him the knowledge that somewhere in the world, a brave little girl was facing her challenges with the strength they had given each other on one magical afternoon in London. The rules hadn't changed, but the understanding of when compassion must override everything else had been forever transformed. Thomas Williams had learned that sometimes the greatest act of service is knowing when to break the silence and speak to the courage you see in others.